At 32 years of age, Clara stood shivering on the wind-battered porch of a structure that seemed more shadow than wood. Her entire life reduced to the fraying edges of her wool shawl and the heavy, hollow ache of a betrayal by the rail syndicate that had seized her family's homestead under a web of false debt. With exactly $7.12 remaining in her coin purse, the final, pathetic sum salvaged from the sale of her father's heirloom watch, she had done the unthinkable. Signing the deed for the sun-bleached saloon in the ghost-ridden outskirts of Oakhaven for $6.50. A purchase the local magistrate called an act of pure madness, yet beneath the sagging, dust-choked rafters lay a secret that would not only mend her broken spirit, but breathe a forgotten, righteous life back into the dying town, though she did not yet know what the shadows held. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Clara. If you believe that the most broken things often hold the most beautiful stories, tell us in the comments. Clara was born into the harsh, red clay silence of the high plains, where the only currency that truly mattered was the strength of one's word and the calluses on one's palms. She was the daughter of a stonemason who believed that every rock held a song, if only one had the patience to listen for the resonance. From her earliest days, she learned to read the grain of oak and the temper of iron, finding a strange, quiet dignity in the way things fit together or fell apart. While other children chased the horizon, Clara spent her afternoons in her father's workshop, learning that the foundation of a home was not merely mortar and stone, but the integrity of the intent placed within its walls. She possessed a rare watchful grace, an ability to see the inherent value in a discarded piece of timber or a cracked whetstone, always cleaning and mending what others deemed beyond repair. It was this virtuous, stubborn, almost sacred reverence for the overlooked that defined her upbringing. She did not crave the fine silks or the parlor gossip of the growing frontier towns. Instead, she found her joy in the structural honesty of a well-built barn or the way a garden thrived when the soil was treated with genuine care. This was not a softness, but a resilient, enduring kind of strength, a rootedness that made her stand taller than the prairie grass in a gale. Her neighbors often remarked that Clara looked at the world as if she were waiting for it to speak, and she moved through her chores with a deliberate, rhythmic peace that suggested she understood the world better than it understood her. She grew up under a sky that seemed to stretch into eternity, learning to navigate by the stars and the shifts in the wind. Her mother, a woman of quiet, unshakable faith, taught her the importance of record-keeping, of ensuring that every scrap of information from the planting dates of the winter wheat to the names of the travelers who stopped at their gate was documented with care. This habit of observation would serve her well in the years to come, long before she understood the value of a legacy. She learned that a house is more than just a place to sleep. It is a repository of memories, a vessel for the stories of those who built it. As she entered her 20s, she became the backbone of her father's homestead, managing the finances with a precision that bordered on art. She knew the cost of every nail, every bushel of grain, and every roll of wire used on their farm. She believed, quite simply, that if you looked after the small things, the large things would eventually take care of themselves. It was a philosophy of stewardship that she carried like a shield, never suspecting that the very foundations of her life were being chipped away by forces far larger and more deceitful than she could have imagined. But life on the frontier has a way of testing the most anchored souls. The downfall began not with a natural disaster or a failure of spirit, but with the cold, calculated machinery of the Western Rail and Land Syndicate. They were a company that saw the vast open spaces not as homes, but as ledgers to be balanced in their favor. When the rail lines pushed westward, they brought with them a tide of litigation and predatory contracts that choked the life out of families like Clara's. Her father, a man of simple honor, had signed a document he believed was a communal water rights agreement, only to find it was a surreptitious transfer of ownership for their land. Within 2 brutal seasons, the legal fees and the orchestrated seizure of their livestock left them destitute. Her father passed in the bitter winter of that year, his heart simply failing under the weight of the injustice, leaving Clara to face the predatory agents alone. She watched as they dismantled the home she had helped build, selling the planks and the rafters to the highest bidder while she was pushed onto the dirt path with nothing but a trunk of modest belongings and a handful of coins. The humiliation was not in the poverty itself, but in the absolute erasure of her family's presence on the land. The process was slow and suffocating. First came the men with measuring tapes and clipboards, men who refused to make eye contact and spoke in technical jargon that Clara's father could barely follow. They spoke of eminent domain and retuvway, as if they were divine decrees. Then came the sheriff, a man whose badge seemed to weigh heavy on his conscience but whose paycheck came from the syndicate's pockets. He arrived on a Tuesday morning, the air thick with the smell of approaching rain, and gave them exactly 48 hours to vacate. Clara watched her father's spirit break in real time. He walked the perimeter of their land one last time, touching the posts of the fence they had set together, his hand trembling. She stood by him, silent, her heart hardening in a way she knew would never truly soften again. When they finally left, the homestead felt like a ghost town before they were even gone. The silence that followed was deafening. She was forced to walk toward the skeletal remains of Oakhaven, a town that had once been a bustling trade post but had withered away when the rail bypassed its valley, leaving behind only the rot of broken dreams and the bitter dust of abandonment. It was in Oakhaven that she found the sun-bleached saloon, a structure that looked as though it were slowly being reclaimed by the earth itself. The windows were opaque with layers of grime, and the sign hung by a single rusted hinge groaning in the constant wind. The town clerk, a man who had long ago traded his ambition for a bottle of cheap rye, laughed when Clara placed her $7.12 on the counter, telling her that the building was a death trap, a place where even the spiders had surrendered to the rot. He tried to dissuade her, citing the collapsing floorboards and the structural instability of the roof, but Clara saw something he did not. She saw the quality of the original redwood beams, still defiant against the decay, and she felt a strange, magnetic pull toward the structure, a sense that it was waiting for someone who cared enough to listen to its history. She purchased it for $6.50, leaving her with barely enough to buy a loaf of bread and a candle. As she pushed open the heavy, stubborn door for the first time, a plume of dust danced in the sliver of sunlight, and she heard the settling groan of the rafters, a sound that felt less like a collapse and more like a sigh of relief. The interior was a graveyard of broken furniture and shattered glass. Tables were stacked in corners, covered in thick layers of gray dust. The air tasted of ancient tobacco and stale neglect. Most would have seen a ruin, but Clara saw a canvas. She spent her first night curled up on a hard wooden bench in the corner, listening to the house breathe. The wind whistled through gaps in the siding, a mournful, hollow sound that seemed to tell the story of the town's decline. She knew that she had spent nearly everything she had on this shell, and the weight of her choice pressed down on her chest. What if the clerk was right? What if she had simply bought a coffin for her own dreams? But as she lay there, she noticed the way the moon cast shadows across the floorboards, patterns that seemed almost deliberate, pointing toward the heavy central support beam that ran the length of the ceiling. There was something about that beam, something about the way it seemed to anchor the entire room, that drew her attention. She fell asleep with the conviction that she had not made a mistake. She had made an investment in her own survival. The first few weeks were a symphony of scraping, sweeping, and mending. Clara lived in the back room, wrapped in a blanket, eating sparingly while she worked to stabilize the foundation. It was during the third week, while she was bracing a sagging beam in the far corner of the grand room, that her pry bar struck something that did not sound like wood. It was a hollow, metallic click that sent a shiver through her fingertips. Digging into the shadowed gap between two heavy joists, she pulled out a leather-bound satchel, dry and brittle, containing not gold, but a series of detailed logs, land surveys, and a collection of letters tied with a frayed blue ribbon. As she sat in the dim light of her single candle, reading through the elegant, hurried script, she realized she had stumbled upon the true history of Oakhaven. Not the one the syndicate told, but the one they had burned to hide. These were the original records of the town founders, documenting a community trust that had been legally established and then buried by the very men who had stripped Clara of her own inheritance. The names in the logs were those of the families who had been driven out, their claims invalidated by forged documents. Among the papers was a map, clearly marked with a location beneath the floorboards of the saloon, not a hidden fortune of gold. but the original notarized deed to the entire valley, proving that the land was never legally the syndicate's to take. The documents were written in the hand of a woman named Elspeth, a former schoolteacher who had clearly been the town's silent intellectual architect. Her logs detailed the years of steady growth, the investment of every family in the town, and the eventual arrival of the syndicate. Elspeth had meticulously documented every threat, every bribe, and every instance of coercion. She had been the one to hide these records, fearing that the truth would be destroyed if she stayed. As Clara read, she felt a profound connection to this woman from the past. She saw the same resilience, the same commitment to justice, that she felt within her own heart. The letters were not just documents. They were a legacy, a baton passed across the decades to someone who finally possessed the patience to read them. Each entry was a piece of a puzzle that Clara was slowly assembling. She realized that Oakhaven hadn't just been abandoned by progress. It had been murdered by greed. And here, in her hands, was the weapon she needed to reverse that crime. The mystery deepened as Clara traced the letters to a deeper story. It became clear that the sun-bleached saloon had been more than just a place of commerce. It had been the nerve center of the valley. It was where the town council had met, where the school funds had been collected, and where the secret trust for the valley's future had been kept. The syndicate had burned records, intimidated witnesses, and forced people off their land. But they had never been able to find this cache. Clara spent nights poring over the maps, comparing them to the current layout of the valley. She saw the original boundaries, the protected water sources, and the communal grazing lands that had been stolen. It was a clear, undeniable record of systematic theft. As she mapped out the pieces, she began to see the faces of the people who had been wronged, to families who now worked for the syndicate as tenant farmers on their own ancestral land. She realized that her own story was just one small part of a much larger, more tragic tapestry. The realization was both heavy and empowering. She was no longer just a woman who had bought a ruin. She was the custodian of a town's stolen identity. She began to spend her days outside, walking the land that now belonged to the syndicate in name, but to the people in history. She saw the land with new eyes. She saw the potential for the gardens, the orchards, and the pastures that the founders had envisioned. She saw the potential for a community that wasn't subservient to a distant corporation, but was instead rooted in the soil itself. She began to wonder how she could ever bring this information to light without being silenced herself. The syndicate was powerful, and they were ruthless. If they found out what she had, they wouldn't hesitate to take the saloon and perhaps more away from her. She needed a strategy. She needed allies. But in a town where everyone was broken and afraid, who could she trust? She looked to the past for guidance, studying the way Elspeth had navigated the early days of the town. She realized that the key was not to force a confrontation, but to build a foundation of truth that could not be easily dismantled. She started by talking to the local people, not about the syndicate, but about the history of the land. She spoke to the old men who sat on the porch of the general store, asking about the stories they remembered, about the families who had lived in the valley before the rail. She listened more than she spoke. Collecting memories like she had collected the documents, she was building a bridge between the present and the forgotten past. Some were suspicious, wondering why a young woman would care about things that had long since been buried. Others, however, began to thaw. They saw the way she was mending the saloon, the way she was respecting the history of the building, and they began to open up. She heard tales of the forced sales, the nighttime visits from syndicate enforcers, and the slow, agonizing departure of friends and neighbors. Every story they told confirmed what she had read in the logs. The picture was becoming clearer, the evidence more compelling. The opposition, however, was not blind to her movements. Mr. Sterling, the local representative of the syndicate, was a man who thrived on control. He didn't like the way the woman at the saloon was asking questions. He noticed the way the townspeople were starting to talk, the way the atmosphere in Oakhaven was shifting from resignation to something else. He was a man who lived by the rule that power is only as strong as the fear it instills. He decided to pay Clara a visit. He arrived at the saloon one afternoon, his polished boots starkly out of place in the dust, his suit coat perfectly pressed. He didn't come to argue. He came to intimidate. He told Clara that she was living on condemned property, that the town was slated for demolition to make way for a new rail depot, and that it would be in her best interest to take his offer of $10 and leave immediately. He leaned in close, his voice cold and calculated, suggesting that accidents happen to people who make themselves obstacles to progress. Clara looked at him really, looked at him manned, saw not the master of the valley, but a man who was deeply, profoundly afraid of the truth. She didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She simply told him that the saloon was her home, and she intended to keep it. She told him that she wasn't interested in his money, and that the history of this place was not for sale. Sterling was taken aback. He was used to people who were either desperate for a quick buck or paralyzed by the threat of force. He wasn't used to someone who seemed to have nothing to lose and everything to protect. He left with a cold warning, his eyes scanning the saloon as if looking for the source of her sudden courage. After he was gone, Clara felt the tremor in her hands for the first time. She knew then that the threat was real, that she was walking on a knife's edge. But she also knew that the truth was her armor. She went back to the rafters, back to the documents, and began to prepare for the confrontation that she knew was coming. She realized that she couldn't fight alone. She needed the town to stand with her. She began to organize small, quiet meetings in the back room of the saloon. At first, only a few people came, the ones who had the most to lose and the least to hide. She showed them the documents. She showed them the original deeds, the maps, and the letters. The effect was immediate and profound. They saw their own names, the names of their parents, the names of the places they had once called home. It was like a sudden, bright light being turned on in a dark room. They realized they hadn't been defeated because they were wrong. They'd been defeated because they hadn't known their own strength. They began to share their own pieces of the puzzle, their own memories, their own small acts of defiance. The saloon, which had once been a place of quiet decay, began to hum with the energy of a community rediscovering its own voice. As the weeks passed, the momentum grew. Clara was the center of it, but she was not the leader. She was the catalyst. She allowed the town to take ownership of the truth. They began to collect their own evidence, to document their own stories, and to form a united front. They were preparing for the upcoming land auction, a public event that the syndicate planned to use to finalize their claim on the last remaining parts of the valley. Clara knew this was the moment. The auction would be attended by regional officials, by journalists from the city, and by the public. It would be the perfect stage for the truth to be laid bare. She worked tirelessly, refining the documents, organizing the proof, and coaching the townspeople on how to present their claims. She was the one who had found the secret, but it was the community that would carry it across the finish line. The day of the auction arrived, a crisp, clear day that felt heavy with anticipation. The syndicate had set up a platform in the middle of town, Sterling presiding over the proceedings with an air of practiced indifference. The crowd was a mix of syndicate employees and the weary, silent people of Oakhaven. When the first lot was announced, Clara stepped forward. She didn't shout. She walked to the front of the platform with the dignity of a woman who had walked through fire and come out on the other side. She held the satchel, the same one she had pulled from the rafters, as if it were a sacred relic. She stood before Sterling, the silence in the town square so absolute that the rustle of the wind sounded like a roar. She began to speak, her voice steady and clear, reaching every corner of the square. She spoke not of herself, but of the history of the valley, of the families who had built it, and of the fraud that had been used to steal it from them. She laid the documents out on the table, one by one. She presented the original deeds, the maps, and the letters. She pointed to the signatures, the dates, and the legal records that were now impossible to ignore. The crowd began to murmur, then to cheer. The syndicate's employees looked on in disbelief as their carefully constructed narrative began to crumble. Sterling tried to dismiss her, to call her a fraud, to threaten her with arrest. But the truth was too heavy, too concrete. A reporter from the regional paper stepped forward, taking notes, his eyes wide as he realized the magnitude of the story. The officials who had been sent to oversee the auction were now looking at the documents with genuine curiosity, their own sense of duty stirred by the weight of the evidence. The syndicate's authority, so carefully maintained by fear and manipulation, began to dissipate in the light of the revealed truth. The restoration did not happen overnight. There were legal battles, there were investigations, and there were attempts by the syndicate to intimidate the townspeople one last time. But the truth was out, and it had a life of its own. The people of Oakhaven were no longer isolated. They had the support of the public, the attention of the media, and the strength of their own reclaimed history. The syndicate was eventually forced to retreat, their predatory claims invalidated, and the land returned to the people who had built it. The valley began to change. Gardens were replanted, homes were repaired, and the sense of community that had been lost for so long was slowly, painstakingly rebuilt. The sun-bleached saloon became the center of this new life, a library and a meeting hall where the records of the valley were kept and where the history of its people was honored. Clara remained its steward, the woman who had paid pocket change for a ruin and found the soul of a community within its rafters. She did not seek fame or a reward. She found her satisfaction in the simple, dignified work of helping a town learn how to stand on its own feet again. She often sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun dip behind the plains, feeling the rhythm of a community being stitched back together. She had lost her family home, but in its place, she had found a deeper, more resilient connection to the people around her. The saloon remained a testament to the fact that when everything is stripped away, the only things that truly last are the truths we fight for and the integrity with which we build. The town of Oakhaven, once a ghost of itself, became a beacon of what is possible when the overlooked are finally given a voice. The story of Clara and the sun-bleached saloon is a reminder that value is rarely found in the things we are told to prize, but in the places we are told to abandon. We often walk past the broken and the forgotten, never realizing that underneath the dust and the decay, there may be a truth waiting for the right hands to uncover it. Clara's journey from a destitute daughter of the plains to the guardian of Oakhaven's history is a testament to the power of quiet resilience. It teaches us that justice is not always a loud, violent victory, but often a patient, meticulous restoration of what has been lost. The saloon, once a symbol of rot, became the bedrock of a new, honorable chapter for everyone in the valley. Like the rafters that held the secrets of the past, we all possess the capacity to hold on to what is right, even when the world seems determined to tear it down. The true wealth of the American frontier was never in the gold or the rail lines. It was in the courage of individuals who, like Clara, refused to let the truth be buried under the shifting sands of time. She looked at her hands, still scarred from the labor, and felt a profound sense of peace. She had not set out to change the world. She had only set out to save herself, and in doing so, she had saved a piece of the world that was worth preserving. The saloon stood strong, its timbers solid, its history preserved, a quiet monument to the power of one person's choice to care. She knew that as long as the rafters held, the story would continue to be told, and as long as the truth was spoken, the town of Oakhaven would never again be forgotten. She was no longer just Clara. She was the keeper of the valley, the woman who had looked into the shadows and found the light. And that, she knew, was a fortune far greater than any gold the syndicate could have ever hoped to steal. Thank you for walking through this chapter of history with us. We're truly grateful for your presence in these stories, for it is your attention that keeps these forgotten tales alive and breathing. We invite you to hold this story close and perhaps consider the places and people in your own life that you might have once written off. What is a time you found value in something others had already written off? Till next time, stay close.